Generally, my biggest concern has been just the amount of scrutiny that's been levied towards voting accessibility and voting rights in general. We're hearing a lot of laws that are being passed under the justification or the guise of free and fair elections, or restoring faith in our elections. And ultimately, in South Dakota, we have fair elections, we have free elections. We don't have a huge issue of non-citizens voting in our elections. These are all, from my opinion, just convenient guises to use for our legislators to try to choose their voters rather than having voters choose their representations.
Welcome back to Searchlight Report, a podcast from South Dakota Searchlight that brings you up to date on policy and politics in the Mount Rushmore state. I'm your host, Meghan O'Brien. The primary election is Tuesday. While Republican voters should anticipate choosing their nominees for governor, the legislature, and the U.S. House and Senate, Democrats and independents shouldn't assume that there's nothing on their ballot. Due to new laws combining state and local elections, they may have county, city, or school races or local ballot questions to consider. To learn more about what voters can expect Tuesday, or if they vote early, I spoke with Samantha Chapman, the advocacy manager for the American Civil Liberties Union of South Dakota. Just to get started, could you explain to listeners why early and absentee voting were delayed this year and how you think that's affected voters?
Yeah, so early and absentee voting was delayed this year because the statutory deadline for petitions to be filed with the Secretary of State landed on the 5th week, essentially, of March, whereas usually there are 4 weeks in March. And so there was less time between the filing deadline with the Secretary of State's office, the amount of time that the Secretary of State had to spend to certify the petitions that were submitted for candidates, and then the deadline for when county auditors had to have ballots ready to go for absentee voting. Additionally, further complicating things is that this is the first year that South Dakota has ever combined our federal, state, municipal, and school board elections all on the same dates in some communities like Sioux Falls and Rapid City. For example, even just in Pennington County alone, there are more than 300 different computations of ballots. And so making sure that every single ballot is prepared, coming out correctly with all of the candidates who have been thoroughly certified by the Secretary of State's office, making sure that all challenges have been worked through people's petitions. That all takes time, and there just wasn't enough time to get all that done and then get that information to the auditors, who can then order the ballots to be printed in all of the different computations that were necessary. There was a piece of legislation that was introduced earlier this year during a legislative session that would have allowed for ballots to be printed on demand. Had that bill passed, I think we would not have had the same delay with the absentee ballots being available, but because state law still requires them to be ordered and printed, they couldn't be ready to go on time.
Right. And so how did that affect voters who were planning to get out early and cast their ballot then?
I think one of the biggest impacts is for people who are living overseas, or such as our UOCAVA voters who are serving our country in United States consulates and in other countries, who have to plan well in advance to get to submit that absentee ballot application and then hopefully get their ballot in time so they can vote and get it sent back in circumstances where mail might take longer. Additionally, folks who have plans to travel and be unavailable during the outside of election day, essentially. And if maybe perhaps the only window of time that they could exercise their right to vote was right away when absentee ballots were supposed to be ready, they might be really crunched for time with fewer days in that window of absentee voting.
Okay. And what do people need to bring with them to vote on Tuesday?
It's important that people remember that nothing has changed in terms of what is required to vote at the polls. So when you show up to vote at your polling location on Tuesday, what you need to bring is either a state-issued ID with your picture of your face on it and your name as it appears in the voter registration book. You can also you can use a either a driver's license, like I said, a state issued like non-driver's identification card, a tribal ID with a photo. Any of those forms of ID, they can even be expired as long as your face matches your face and your name is correctly spelled as it appears in the voter registration book. And if you're a student, you can also use a current student ID issued by a South Dakota state university or college.
And so if someone hasn't voted since the November general election, what's something new that they should expect?
That's a good question. I think what you'll see on our ballot here in the primary election in June is just a substantial ballot, right? So it's not just our federal races. It's also going to be, like, as I mentioned, our municipal races, our school board elections, county commissions in some circumstances, and also sometimes there might be city charter questions as well. So there's going to be a lot on the ballot. It's important that voters are taking the time to research all of the different candidates, their positions on various issues, and what those city charter amendments might look like as well. Yeah, I would say like that's probably one of the biggest differences.
And so the registration deadline for this election is already passed, but a new state law was in effect for voter registration ahead of this election, and that required people to prove their citizenship when registering. How has that affected voting rights?
That has been a huge issue already this year. So the new law that went into effect was Senate Bill 175 that had an emergency clause, which means that as soon as Governor Larry Roden signed that bill, it became law immediately. That law requires you to present some sort of documented proof of citizenship when you are registering to vote. And so if you don't provide that documentation, you are registered to vote as a federal only voter, meaning that people who are registered Republicans as federal only will have a Republican primary ballot, but Democrats, independent, no party affiliation voters who are federal only voters will have no ballot at the polls this election. So we've seen so far some of the numbers coming back. There are roughly, I think, 1,500 or so voters who have been designated as federal only voters statewide. And at least I think 200 of those voters were people who registered to vote and just simply did not have that documentary proof of citizenship on them when they submitted their voter registration, meaning that these are otherwise eligible voters who should have a voice in their local elections and are not being able to do so because they're not carrying around a passport or a copy of their birth certificate to show their proof of citizenship.
And can you explain to listeners what's going on with the new federal only ballot? I mean, I know that you kind of touched on folks that are registered Republicans are going to have that U.S. representative Congress ballot, but then folks who aren't registered Republicans won't be getting that ballot.
Yeah, so people who are designated as federal only voters and who don't have a federal primary to vote on will have zero ballot. They will not have anything to cast a ballot on June 2nd. This is problematic for a lot of reasons, not only because of people who are being denied their full access to the ballot because they don't have documentary proof of citizenship, but also folks who are full-time travelers and who have registered to vote using a PO box or using a mail forwarding service and have spent time in our state. They are registering their vehicles here, they're paying taxes here, and yet because they are using a PO box for voter registration, they're being denied their access to having a voice in local decisions as well. And so there might be, and there's also no notification process for people who have been redesignated as federal voters. So folks might be traveling back to South Dakota with plans to vote in the general or in the primary election. They may have been already redesignated as federal only voters, and then they're turned away at the polls because they simply don't have a ballot, thereby being entirely disenfranchised.
And so I kind of want to go a little bit to then what should voters know about a provisional ballot and their ability to request one?
Yeah, absolutely. So there should be very few circumstances where if you turn up to vote and let's say you're not on the voter registration list and you believe that you should be, you can ask for a provisional ballot, and the poll workers should give you that provisional ballot. Important to know about provisional ballots is that those are not counted on election day. Those ballots are then kind of set aside, and county auditors will go through and double, triple check to make sure that you weren't somehow inadvertently left off of the voter registration list and you should have been on there, or figuring out what the situation happened, like why you weren't on the voter registration list. But all voters should be offered either their actual ballot or a provisional ballot, unless they're somehow just at the wrong polling location, in which case, hopefully, poll workers will direct you to the right precinct. Or then the other circumstances, if you have been redesignated as a federal only voter and you don't have a primary election to vote in.
And so what other problems do you kind of see people commonly encountering at the polls?
One of my biggest concerns is there was another law that passed earlier this year that allows people to challenge voter registration based on citizenship status. There is not a clear process that has been outlined for what that challenge should look like, for what should be required from somebody who is challenging another voter to submit with that challenge. And I'm concerned also that people might just be confused about when and where these laws apply. Also with the documentary proof of citizenship as well. I'm concerned that people might think that they have to bring a passport or a birth certificate with them to the polls to vote. You do not have to bring that if you are already registered to vote when you turn up to vote. I'm concerned that people might think that they can challenge other voters based on their perception of what they think those voters' citizenship status might be. That is not allowed. That is not what that law does. You can't try to kick somebody out of a polling location because you don't think that they're a US citizen. That's not how that law works either. So my biggest concern in general is just there being the overwhelming confusion that both voters and potentially poll workers are experiencing, trying to navigate all these new laws that primarily affect voter registration, but that's not necessarily clear to the general public.
And at the last election, the ACLU sent out election observers to kind of be in those spaces. Are you guys planning to do that again? And what would that plan look like?
Yes, we have I think roughly between 25 and 30 trained election observers in Minnehaha and Pennington counties to be present at the polls on Election Day on June 2nd, to be a resource to voters who may have questions, or for folks who are being turned away unlawfully, for people who discover at the polls that they have been redesignated as a federal only voter. We've got election observers present to keep an eye on all of that, document those things, chat with voters who may have been disenfranchised, as well as document the things that are going right too. Sometimes we hear people trying to cast doubt in the fairness of our elections, and by having our election observers present at the polls, we can also have an impartial record of things that are done really well.
And you'd mentioned too, the ballots are quite stacked this year with not only state and federal elections, but also local decisions. What would you say to people who are registered Democrat or independent and assume that they don't have anything to vote on in the primary?
That is a message we've been trying to get out desperately, which is that if you are registered to vote, chances are you have still a lot to vote for, even if you are not a registered Republican. It is so important that you take some time to look up what your sample ballot might be on the Secretary of State's website, research all of that, and come prepared to the polling location. It's legal for you to fill out a sample ballot and bring that with you into the poll if you think you might forget some of the information that you've researched. You can bring that as a resource with you when you go to vote.
And so then beyond this election, how do you think that recent U.S. Supreme Court decisions weakening the Federal Voting Rights Act will affect South Dakota?
I'm concerned that that the framework and justification in Louisiana versus Calais might be applied in 2030 and 2031 when our state legislature looks at redistricting South Dakota for our state legislative maps. The Louisiana versus Calais decision focuses on racial discrimination in drawing congressional maps, but there was an amicus brief that was submitted in that case, specifically pointing to a couple of voting rights cases out of North Dakota as it pertains to tribal lands and the way that their state legislative maps were initially drawn to try to dilute Native voters and Native representation. We want to make sure here in South Dakota that we continue to have fair representation for our Indigenous voters here in South Dakota, that they are not being unfairly diluted and chopped up in their legislative districts, so that they can still have meaningful representation in our state legislature.
And what else do you see affecting South Dakota voting rights recently or in the future?
Generally, my biggest concern has been just the amount of scrutiny that's been levied towards voting accessibility and voting rights in general. We're hearing a lot of laws that are being passed under the justification or the guise of free and fair elections, or restoring faith in our elections. And ultimately, in South Dakota, we have fair elections, we have free elections. We don't have a huge issue of non-citizens voting in our elections. These are all, from my opinion, just convenient guises to use for our legislators to try to choose their voters rather than having voters choose their representation. So I'm concerned about the vast number of elections-related legislation that has passed in the past few years, and I'm hoping that trend does not continue in the future. But we'll continue to keep an eye on it, and we'll continue to have a voice in those conversations representing South Dakotans and trying to reduce other attempts at disenfranchisement.
I think that's all the questions that I have for you. Do you have anything else that you feel like the voters of South Dakota should know?
I just think it's really important for folks to take their right to vote and their responsibility to vote very, very seriously. This election in June will have historic consequences for the state of South Dakota for decades to come. And having a voice in who represents you at every seat of government is critical. We can never take it for granted. It means which schools get funded, which roads get paved. All of these different elected officials hold so much power over our daily lives. We can't sit back and let other people choose who represents us.
That's all we have for this episode of Searchlight Report. Audio for this episode of the podcast came from recordings by South Dakota Searchlight. The podcast is based on reporting by South Dakota Searchlight's staff, editor Seth Tupper, senior reporter John Holt, and reporters Joshua Heyer, Mackenzie Huber, and me. I write the scripts and produce the audio with editing by Seth Tupper. South Dakota Searchlight is part of States Newsroom, the nation's largest nonprofit news organization. Until next time, I'm South Dakota Searchlight's Meghan O'Brien with the Searchlight Report.